Hello, my name is Jay Williams, and I'm a professor in the Department of Human Nutrition, Foods, and Exercise at Virginia Tech here in Blacksburg, Virginia. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, and I want to thank you for joining in. For those in Europe, a good afternoon, and for those on the West Coast, Asia, and Australia, a very good morning. First, a few housekeeping duties before we get started. If you've not done so yet, please select the Listen Only audio option. You may have done this when you initially signed in. If not, select this on the left side of your browser. We have around 100 attendees today, so this helps reduce the background noise if all the microphones are turned off. Second, feel free to ask questions anytime. Just use the Ask a Question button located at the top left part of your browser. Those questions come to me, and I'll try to answer as many as I can as we go along. We will be recording this broadcast, so we will provide you a link once it's over. Otherwise, let's get started. A quick outline of where we're headed. What I'd like to do is first frame the problem, then talk about diet strategies to help get your players ready to compete during a congested schedule. This includes pre-tournament preparation, recovery, and preparation for the next day's matches. I also want to address a few issues that I'm often asked about, ones that you might also encounter during a tournament, specifically things like water, sports drinks, and supplements. Again, feel free to ask questions throughout. We'll also have a bit of time at the end of the session for questions. This past weekend, I was reading an interview with tennis great Ivan Lendl in a recent issue of Tennis Magazine, and he was asked about his early thoughts on training and diet and nutrition. And reflecting on his career, he said at one point he was feeling very tired, and his trainers had a suspicion that he had developed mononucleosis, and that had turned out not to be true, and that it turned out to be nutritional. And he stated that that's why he began watching his nutrition and allowed him to train harder and to train better. And before that, he would think nothing of drinking a 2-liter bottle of soda with dinner. He said that once nutrition was explained to him, all of a sudden things started getting better for him. Unfortunately, unlike Ivan Lendl, many young players have not yet seen the light as far as nutrition and performance go. Players can expend up to 1,500 calories during a competitive 90-minute match. They may also lose a considerable amount of fluid, especially if the matches are played in the heat. When we ask players what they know about diet and nutrition, and we ask them to record their diet, what we find is that most eat too few calories and they eat too few carbohydrates. What carbohydrates they do eat tend to be high in simple sugars and come from things like sweets and sodas. In addition, they often drink too little fluid to replace what is lost during a match. The result is they often arrive at training, they often arrive at matches in an undernourished and an underhydrated state. So, coaches have a challenge, helping these players understand the link between performance and a solid diet. This becomes even more of a problem during a congested calendar, when proper nutrition becomes even more important. It's quite common for youth, club, and college teams to play back-to-back matches with less than 24 hours for recovery. It's also common for teams to play multiple matches with just a single day off. In fact, the top scenario shown here, this Thursday, Friday, Sunday match schedule, was the format played by the 2013 Atlantic 10 Conference Tournament champions here in the U.S. So, you can imagine and may have experienced the difficult nutritional challenges that are faced by players with this sort of a schedule. There just isn't much time to recover. So, how do we deal with this? So, what happens to energy stores during this type of schedule? If we look at a player's energy stores, and in this case muscle glycogen levels, muscle glycogen may be nearly depleted during the end of a match. If a player eats a solid diet that's high in carbohydrates, muscle glycogen is generally restored within about 24 hours. And this is shown by the green line here. If we extend this out over several days, we'll see that muscle glycogen is depleted during practice, during training, during a match, and it returns to normal by the next day, again, if the player is eating a solid diet. However, if the player opts for a weak diet, one is high in fats, energy stores may not recover during the next day, and he or she begins the next day with an energy deficit. If this continues for several days, you can see that the player soon puts himself or herself at a tremendous disadvantage. Muscle glycogens don't recover, and in fact, they slowly decline as the week progresses. What we want to talk about today is how to follow the green line, the high carbohydrate diet line, and avoid the red one. The key to maintaining energy stores and being ready to play the next day's match is preparation. Players should begin prepping for the tournament well in advance, they should begin thinking about tomorrow's match today. During the days leading up to the start of the tournament, players should focus on high carbohydrate foods such as pasta, rice, fish, fresh fruits, and vegetables. Also add lean meats such as turkey and chicken as their protein sources. They should definitely avoid foods that are high in fat, foods that are fried, as well as simple sugars found in pastries and sodas and candies. Basically, they should aim for a diet that's about 65 to 70% carbohydrates, 20 to 25% fats, and about 10% protein. In general, when they look at their plate, it should be mostly covered with carbohydrates and lean proteins and very little fats and sugary snacks. It's just as important to drink plenty of fluids during the days leading up to a tournament, especially if the forecast is for a hot, humid condition, and especially to replenish the fluids lost during training the week before the tournament starts. During meals, they should concentrate on drinks like water, fruit juices, and low-fat milk. Again, avoid sugar-sweetened beverages like soda and so forth. Again, the key is preparation. Begin eating and drinking well before the start of the tournament. So we do have our first question, and the question is, should I have my players spend time counting calories? The answer to that is probably not. It can be a little bit frustrating. What I would suggest is to focus more on a qualitative approach, that is selecting solid foods. However, recording or jotting down what they eat on a regular basis can be a good way to help identify bad habits, and it may help the players understand the link between eating right and playing well, or vice versa. For example, have players record and think about what they eat leading up to a match and how they felt and how they played. Using this info, they may be able to see a pattern emerge. However, counting calories and keeping track of the numbers can be a little bit difficult and a little bit frustrating. Once the team arrives at the tournament and it's day one, it's now time to consider what to eat for a pre-match meal. Exactly what to eat depends on the timing as well as individual preferences. Typically, teams eat a pre-match meal 3 to 4 hours before kickoff. Sometimes it's a bit closer if the team has an early morning match. In either case, the athlete should select high carbohydrate foods, things like pancakes, oatmeal, pasta, or lean meat sandwiches. They should definitely avoid anything fried and anything covered in sort of a rich, creamy sauce. They should eat some proteins, but how much depends a little bit on the timing. The more time there is between the meal and the kickoff, the more protein is needed. In this case, the key is to be satisfied, but not to feel so full that the player is sluggish. This is also a time where personal preference enters the equation. Different players respond differently to the types and amounts of foods they eat. What works for one player may not work for another. And so as long as the fundamentals of high carbohydrate foods and low-fat choices are followed, you can allow for a few individual choices in terms of the types of food eaten and the amounts. So we have a second question, and that question is, what are your thoughts on the glycemic index of the pre-match meal? First, the glycemic index is a measure of how much a particular food affects blood glucose or blood sugar. Simple sugars have a high glycemic index because they can cause blood pressure to rise very quickly. Sometimes it's called a so-called sugar rush. More complex carbohydrates, such as vegetables and pastas, typically have a low glycemic index because they take a little longer to digest and have a lesser effect on blood glucose. As far as the research into whether or not glycemic index affects the performance in a pre-match meal, the research is a little bit split. Most of the research shows very, very little, if any, effects. Other bits of research show really no effect at all. So in terms of a pre-match meal, the glycemic index doesn't really have a huge effect. It may have an effect on recovery, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. As the match approaches, players should probably drink during the 2 hours before kickoff, especially on a hot day. Sports drinks are a solid choice here. They provide both fluids as well as some additional carbohydrates. Again, personal preference is a bit important since some players feel sluggish if they drink too much fluid. A high carbohydrate snack can also be eaten shortly before kickoff. Things like energy bars and gels may benefit some in terms of providing a little additional carbohydrate right before kickoff. They should avoid things like energy drinks. These tend to contain a large amount of caffeine, which can negatively affect performance, and they can also contribute to dehydration. So we've made it through the first match, and as soon as that match is over, players should start thinking about the next match as soon as possible and the next day's event. Now, this is difficult to understand. Exhaustion, celebrating a big win, or lamenting over a tough loss can make it very difficult to think about tomorrow. However, recovery nutrition may be one of the most important yet most underlooked aspects of match preparation. And this is where planning gets very, very important, having foods and drinks available to players immediately after the match. So it's important to stress to players that what they do immediately after the match has a big impact on how they'll play the next day. The key to maximizing recovery is the first 45 to 60 minutes after the match. This is the critical time. During this window, players should drink fluids as well as eat high carbohydrate snacks that contain a small amount of protein. Sports drinks are great choices since they contain fluids. They also contain carbohydrates and electrolytes that might be lost during the training or a match. And they're also formulated to promote fluid absorption. As for snacks, bagels, bananas, and energy bars are great. They generally have a high carbohydrate content, and they also have a tiny amount of protein. They should follow this up with a high carbohydrate meal later in the day. Also, if a match is going to be played the next day, a late night snack such as a fruit smoothie might also be a great idea. Replacing lost fluids is as equally as important as replacing lost carbohydrates. This is especially true on hot, humid days. Players should replace about 1.5 times the amount of fluid loss. Now, this is on top of what fluids they might normally take in during the day. We can estimate this by the amount of weight that's lost during a match or during training. A 1 kilogram weight loss is roughly equal to about 1.5 liters of fluid, or 2 pounds is about equal to 1.5 quarts of fluid. Players should start drinking soon after the match and continue this over the next 24 hours. Again, this should be spread out. It shouldn't be taken in all at once. But again, remember, this is critical for matches played in the heat. So why is this 45 to 60 minute window so important? Remember, one of our goals is to replace energy stores as quickly and completely as possible. If we look at how muscle glycogen, or energy stores, recover after exercise, what we see is eating and drinking carbohydrates with a small amount of protein sort of jump-starts the recovery process, and that's shown here by the green line. What it does is it leads to a more rapid and more complete restoration of muscle glycogen. If this window is missed, glycogen will still recover during the next 24 hours, but it may not be as quickly and it may not be as completely as it is if we take advantage of this window. So, focusing on the time immediately after the match can greatly benefit performance the next day. One key recovery strategy that has gained a lot of attention in the last few years is the use of low-fat chocolate milk. This shouldn't be too surprising when one thinks about what's actually in chocolate milk. A single serving of chocolate milk contains a considerable amount of carbohydrates. It also contains a small amount of protein, along with vitamins, minerals, and electrolytes. And because it's low fat, the fat content is generally quite small. As we can see here, again, this serving of chocolate milk contains about 25 grams of carbohydrates, 8 grams of protein, and 2.5 grams of fat. From a nutritional standpoint, this is an ideal recovery beverage. And in fact, research backs this up. There are several studies that show that drinking low-fat chocolate milk after a match may be as effective, and in some cases maybe even more effective, than a traditional approach of a sports drink plus eating a snack. So, drinking chocolate milk after exercise or after a match can be some food for thought. So, we have a question about honey. And the question is, does adding honey to recovery nutrition assist with recovery and muscle repair? Honey is a fantastic source of carbohydrates, so certainly in terms of glycogen replenishment and replacing energy stores, adding honey to a bagel or something like that is a great way to help with glycogen recovery. As far as muscle soreness and muscle damage, the research doesn't show a tremendous effect of honey. It certainly doesn't show any adverse effects. So in terms of honey, using it as a source of carbohydrate for glycogen replacement is an excellent idea. In terms of trying to prevent muscle soreness the next day, it probably doesn't have a whole lot of help in that regard. So now we move on to day 2. The strategy for the second day and for the remainder of the tournament depends a lot on what the team's schedule is for that day. If a second match is played, the schedule probably includes breakfast followed by a pre-match meal. If day 2 is a recovery day, perhaps with a light training session plan, the players have a little bit more leeway in what they eat. However, in either case, they shouldn't stray from the basic concepts of high carbohydrates, lean proteins, and low-fat fluid choices. Also, keep up the fluid intake and continue to follow a solid recovery strategy after both matches as well as training. Before closing out the session, I'd like to address a few issues that players, coaches, as well as parents often ask me about. The first of these is water versus sports drinks. Which is better? The answer to that depends a little bit on the situation. Water is certainly adequate for fluid replacement and to drink with everyday meals. We've been doing this for thousands of years to avoid dehydration, but unfortunately water offers very little other than just fluid. Sports drinks, on the other hand, contain carbohydrates and electrolytes and things that are needed for recovery. In addition, the flavor of sports drinks tends to entice players, especially young players, to drink a little bit more. Now, this can be a good thing during recovery when carbohydrates and fluid intake is important. However, sports drinks are not formulated to be consumed on a daily basis or with every meal. They contain a considerable amount of calories, so drinking several sports drinks each day or drinking them every day with meals can lead to excess weight gain, not to mention a tremendous cost. So the use of sports drinks are designed to be used around the event. But for daily meals, water, fruit juices, and low-fat milks are certainly preferable. This brings up our next question. What about carbonated drinks and beverages, or so-called fizzy drinks? There's nothing wrong with carbonation per se. It's basically CO2 and the body handles it without any problem. Where the difficulty lies with carbonated beverages is they tend to make players full. They may make them feel bloated. So drinking a carbonated drink before a match may not be a good idea. Also, that bloated feeling can limit how much fluid they take in, which can also be a problem. The other problem with carbonated drinks is they're usually found in sodas. And we really don't want kids drinking a lot of sugary sweets and sodas. We'd rather get their carbohydrates from fresh fruits, vegetables, pastas, rice, and those sorts of things. So carbonation per se is not bad, but when it's associated with that bloated feeling or with sugary drinks, it's probably not a good idea. Next, many players tend to be confused about the various types of recovery bars and drinks advertised as recovery shakes. Generally, these are marketed as either an energy or a protein bar. Sometimes they may be marketed as a protein recovery shake. And there is a difference between these. As you can see here, this is a side-by-side comparison of two different recovery bars and a protein recovery shake. And what you can see is the protein bars, those on the right, generally contain fewer carbohydrates. They contain a lot more protein as well as a lot more fat than an energy bar. And this is really not the right mix for recovery. What we want is a small amount of protein that is needed for recovery of muscle glycogen. And some fat is unavoidable, but the key here is the carbohydrate content. In this case, 45 versus 25 grams of carbohydrate. So the higher the carbohydrate content, the better. So during recovery, have players opt for the product on the left with high carbohydrate content and avoid products that advertise higher protein contents. Finally, I often get asked about supplements, anything from vitamins, antioxidants, protein powders, creatine, and energy drinks. As for the first three, a solid diet that's high in fresh fruits and vegetables and contains lean meats will provide, for the most part, all of the vitamins, minerals, and proteins needed to maximize performance. Supplements generally don't provide any noticeable advantage. The only exception is for a player who adjusts their diet because they're trying to lose a few pounds, or maybe following a vegetarian or vegan diet. Those players might benefit from a multivitamin supplement or perhaps some added protein, and that's needed to replace some of the things that might be missing in their normal diet. But the emphasis should be on developing a solid diet rather than relying on supplements. As for caffeine and energy drinks, the consensus is to avoid these. Caffeine can have some unwanted side effects that might diminish performance, such as anxiety, jitteriness. It may affect touch, focus, that sort of thing. Also, caffeine is a potent diuretic, and that can lead to fluid loss, which can then lead to dehydration. So, in general, pass on the supplements and focus on a solid diet to meet all the energy needs needed for this congested schedule. So we have two quick questions on caffeine. One is about caffeine before a match, and the other is caffeine after the match. Again, caffeine can cause players to get anxious. They can cause them to get jittery. Skill can deteriorate with too much caffeine taken in. So again, before a match, it's probably not recommended. After a match, caffeine actually has a negative effect on glycogen resynthesis. So taking in caffeine after a match can actually slow the glycogen recovery process. And again, if a player is already somewhat dehydrated and we take a lot of caffeine, they're going to lose even more fluid, and that's going to compound the problem. So again, try to avoid caffeine both before as well as after the match. So the bottom line is, dealing with a congestive schedule can be very difficult from a nutritional standpoint. However, remember a few key points. One is plan ahead. Preparation, having the right foods available to players to eat at all times is important. Second is eat smart and eat healthy. Focus on high carbohydrates and avoid fats and fried foods and so forth. Drink plenty of fluids to avoid dehydration and avoid relying on supplements to counter an otherwise weak diet. Now, before we close out, we do have a few final questions that I'd like to get to. One question is that you mentioned complex and simple sugars and carbohydrates. What's the difference? First of all, carbohydrates are sugars, and those terms are for the most part interchangeable. Simple sugars are those that are found in table sugar, candy, sodas, and pastries. They include names like glucose, fructose, and sucrose. Complex carbohydrates are those found in breads, pastas, rice, and so forth, also fruits and vegetables. Complex carbohydrates contain combinations of these simple sugars, but they also contain high amounts of fiber as well as vitamins and minerals. And that's where the true advantage lies. They're basically more nutritionally complete than foods with simple sugars. So that's why we encourage players to focus on the complex carbohydrates rather than the simple sugars. The next question is, how many grams per kilogram body weight of carbohydrates would you be advising if the next match is within 24 hours? In general, players are going to need about 8 to 10 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight. For a 60 kilogram or 132 pound player, that's about 480 to 600 grams of carbohydrates over that 24-hour period. Maybe a bit more if the match is intense or if it goes into overtime, that sort of thing. Again, the key is having them eat basically as many carbohydrates as they can get and focus on that window immediately after the match. But again, focus on high carbohydrates, and they should get plenty of that with a normal recovery diet. The last question is, should players try to lose weight during the season? The answer to that is probably not. The energy demands of playing and training are really too high for them to eat less than what's needed for recovery. A better time to try and focus on weight loss would be during the off season, or even maybe during early preseason training. In that case, the caloric deficit that they need is not really going to affect performance, so to speak. But trying to lose weight during season can do that. By taking in too few calories may leave them a bit lethargic and a bit tired during the match. So focus on weight loss at other times other than during the middle of the season. So with that, I will close out today's session. I want to thank everyone for joining today. I hope that the 30 minutes we've spent together has been helpful and informative. We did promise that we would not use your email address for any sort of marketing or spam or anything like that, but we do want to follow up with an email to send you some links. We've been recording this session, and we're going to post it on our website so that you can download it and listen to it again, or you can share it with one of your colleagues. We'll also send you a few links. One of those is about our course. Robin Russell and I offer an online course called The Soccer Diet, the simplest way to improve your team's performance. I also have a book that's in its second edition called The Science Behind Soccer Nutrition, and it's available for purchase through Amazon and so forth. But we do want to follow that up with a little bit of information and also a questionnaire. We want to ask you what you thought about today's session and how we might be able to make improvements for the next one. But again, thank you so much for your time, and we sincerely appreciate you joining in.